Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us once again for our time. Today, I'm accompanied by a dear friend, dear friend, who's a journalist, Pilar Marrero, Venezuela in the house.
Yes, hello. Hi, everyone. Venezolana.
And we're going to reflect on the experience of being a journalist in the world we're living in. But let's start with your journey from Venezuela to the US.
Mm,
Mm.
it was a long time ago. Yeah, what do you want to know?
I'm curious about your experience of transitioning into life in this country, particularly because so much of what we've been reflecting on is the experience of being an immigrant.
Yeah.
And now you see it, and for decades now, through the lens of a journalist. But
Yes.
before you became a journalist, that experience, that journey from Venezuela to the US.
Well, it's this experience keeps happening to people, right? My parents were immigrants in Venezuela. So I came from a family of immigrants, or let's call them what they were, refugees.
Mm.
They were refugees from Spain, from the Spanish Civil War, which happened in the late 30s, before the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
And they were kids, right? My mom was 4 when she left Spain, and my
Mm.
dad was 10, I think. And they were immigrants there. And Venezuela was a country of immigrants back then. So there were lots of immigrants from those wars in Europe,
Mm-hmm.
as well as from South America, like the dictatorships from Argentina, Chile,
Mm-hmm.
Brazil. There were dictatorships all over in South America during those years, like in
Mm-hmm.
the 50s, 60s, 70s.
70s. Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't think that I was gonna be an immigrant. I wasn't really that wasn't my plan. I didn't grow up thinking, "Oh, I'm gonna move to the United States." That never occurred to me. But I did have a curiosity about the world, and I met someone who was living in Los Angeles. I met a Venezuelan young man. I was in college, and I met this man who was already living here in Los Angeles, and
Mm.
we started dating, and I was taking it casually. I was like, yeah, this guy's gonna leave, and that's it, that's fine. And then he invited me to come to LA. And I said, okay, I'll come to LA. So I came to LA thinking, I'm going to be there for a little bit. I don't think this is going to work out.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't really all that sure about this relationship or this move. But I thought, well, it could be interesting, a new experience. And I've never, really been that far. I've never traveled that far from home before. I was 22.
Mm-hmm.
So I came
Youth.
here. Yeah. And I stayed. 37 years later, here I am. And I did marry that guy. We got divorced later on, but I ended up staying and becoming uh, a resident, a citizen, etc., and
Mm-hmm.
practicing. And I had already graduated from journalism school in Venezuela.
Mm-hmm.
So when I came here, I just started working.
And your experience of living in the US as a journalist at that time, so young, and into the present moment where you've had so many experiences of even teaching future journalists,
Hmm.
publishing your books, Killing the American Dream, and in
Yes.
Spanish, El Despertar de una
Mm.
Nueva
Del
América,
sueño
del
americano.
sueño americano.
It's the same book. Publishers just have this idea. Different publishers have these very different ideas of what a title of a book is.
I know.
These sound opposite to each other,
They
right?
do. They
But it's the
do.
same book,
Same book.
just in different languages.
And, all these different experiences covering
Yeah.
presidential elections,
Yes, lots of them.
all kinds of political situations,
Right.
immigrant stories, all of these things that are part of life in the US.
Well, first of all, when I got to LA, what I knew about LA is what I would see on TV, right? Like a Hollywood, this television series I used to watch, and the movies.
Mm-hmm.
When I got here, I was shocked because
Mm-hmm.
it was in Mexican City, pretty much, and I was like, "What?" I did not know that because that's not the image of LA we used to get in the world.
Right.
We used to get only Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was shocked to see this was a city of very recent immigration, not just the immigration of the 1800s or 19 or whatever, early
Right.
1900s,
Right.
but of the 80s, the 70s, the 80s,
Mm-hmm.
the late 60s.
Yes.
And so it was very interesting to me that I came here. I barely spoke English, and I got a job like almost right away at a Spanish newspaper and
Yeah.
started working. And I learned.
Was that La Opinión?
No, that was another newspaper. That
Mm.
newspaper that was a smaller one that existed at the time, doesn't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that was like a crash course in English, right? Because I was already working 6 months after arriving here, and my English wasn't that great, but it improved really fast because I was working,
Mm-hmm.
and I was working mostly in English and then translating and writing in Spanish. But over the years, yes, I did move to what then was the largest Spanish language newspaper in the U.S., La Opinión, and worked there for many years, 27 years, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I had a whole interesting career in radio, in
Yeah.
television, covering mostly politics, immigration, social issues.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'm still a journalist, even though the profession work, the industry nowadays is very difficult. And many journalists that were, doing the job in my time had to go to other professions because
Mm.
there's not as many jobs as there used to be. And some of the jobs are just impossible for some of those old journalists to do. So, so even though I'm not in daily journalism anymore, I'm still in the profession. So I feel good about that.
That's wonderful. I'm
Yeah.
wondering, just for more, context on what makes it difficult for journalists, from earlier generations to remain in the field, to the point of switching careers.
Yeah. Well,
And also, you mentioned that there's a shortage of jobs.
yeah.
Tell me
What
more about
happened?
those
Okay.
challenges.
Well,
Yeah.
what happened was the change. What happened was the internet, the World Wide Web was
Mm-hmm.
what happened.
Mm.
And the change in the business, the way the business is monetized, or the way,
Mm-hmm.
newspapers used to, my newspaper, La Opinión, used to be very large, we used to have more than 500 employees, and sell a lot of ads. When the business changed and the internet came about, it
Yeah.
was it was people thought, oh well, great, we'll have more of an audience, but the problem is, how do you monetize it?
Mm-hmm.
How do you sell those ads? It's not the same business.
Right.
And it's just gotten more difficult, even though now we have more tools, supposedly, to communicate, including social media. Um, the practice of professional journalism has become harder because of that, because of the lack of funding, the lack of monetization. A lot of journalism is moving to nonprofit
Mm.
because that's the only way you can raise money.
I
Yeah, it's
see.
it's very complicated, but
Yeah.
but journalism is still there and it's still needed.
Yeah.
Um, but I was honestly, I would not want to be a newly graduated journalist right now.
At this
It's a
time.
very difficult business right now. Where do to get a job that
Mm.
you can live out of and you can be a journalist, it's not easy.
Not easy.
No.
So many professions have undergone transformation, and in many ways, similar to what you just described, and particularly during the pandemic. I'm wondering your take on how that impacted life as a journalist.
Um I think it just accelerated the challenges of many businesses. However, the pandemic itself was a good time for journalism
Mm.
because there was a lot of need, so there was a lot of money flowing to it. In from nonprofits, from the government, monies like grants or things like that, and people really were relying on the media.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes,
at that
highly.
yes, so at that time, let's say that journalism was appreciated again to a certain extent,
Mm.
because that's the other problem. We are facing a situation where in the United States and maybe even in other countries as well, institutions have lost credibility, and journalism is one of those institutions that has lost credibility. So,
How can that be repaired?
oh God, I wish I knew.
Hmm.
I don't know. I
Hmm.
don't know. It's hard to. I mean, it goes beyond journalism. It's government. It's
Mm-hmm.
the Supreme Court has lost credibility. I mean, as we know,
Mm-hmm.
um, and that's dangerous because I come from a country called Venezuela, where institutions lost credibility,
Mm-hmm.
and when that happened, um, the political winds changed, and we elected someone who became an autocrat, and that regime is still ongoing
Mm-hmm.
25 years later.
Mm-hmm.
So, uh, you know, these things happen. Nobody is above this. No country is
Is
above
above
this.
it. Exactly.
So it worries me in regards to this country.
Yeah.
You know.
One of the things that we've reflected a lot about in this platform is how difficult it was to be yourself, whatever it is that your life involves during the pandemic.
Mm,
And just like journalists were in greater demand during that time, so were people in my field.
yeah.
Clinicians, psychotherapists were and still are um, in high demand. And it was really a difficult time. Like I will never forget to be a therapist. So I'm curious about your experience at that time. How did you navigate it? What helped you? What was challenging for you?
Hmm. The lack of fun. It was all work,
Mm,
work, work. We couldn't have
mm,
any fun.
mm-hmm,
Um, I count myself among the lucky people that had a lot of work at that time
mm-hmm.
and that could do it at home for the most part.
Yeah.
I would sometimes have to go out, but I did cover what the essential workers were doing,
Mm-hmm,
farm workers, for example, and others.
mm-hmm.
Um, Nothing can compare to what they had to face.
Right?
Nothing can compare to what, happened in schools, how kids lost
Yes.
time of schooling, etc. So I consider myself lucky, and I feel like I cannot complain about that time, even though it's hard because I live alone
Mm-hmm.
and I was isolated.
Yeah. Like so
Um,
many.
like so many, it's
Mm-hmm.
true.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I had work, and I had work that gave me purpose.
Mm.
So,
Speaking of which,
mm-hmm,
for so many during the pandemic, purpose became clearer
mm,
or strengthened if it was clear before the pandemic for a lot of people. You know, new things, new ways of doing your work emerged. This, for example, is an example of it for me. I would have never thought of having a podcast before the pandemic. And in fact, uh, while it was unfolding, I didn't realize it was a podcast, you
mm,
know? And so a lot of creativity emerged at that time while we were trying to make sense of what was happening and who we envision ourselves as post pandemic. And so, who's Pilar now?
Well, Pilar is someone that really wants to have a new life.
Mm.
I think during the pandemic, also a lot of people were able to rethink things. As you know, there was a mass resignation, the Great Resignation. A lot of people quit
Yes.
their jobs.
Yes.
Um, I was already I I got laid off from the paper in 2018, right before the pandemic, a couple of years before, and I had started working as freelancer, and my freelance work just strengthened during the pandemic. However, it gave me a lot of freedom, you know, but it also made me think, okay, how much longer do I want to work, and how much longer do I want to live in this country?
Mm.
And that question has been answered because I am leaving this country in about a month.
Mm-hmm.
So I will continue working, and I have some other projects that I want to work on down the line, maybe another book or other things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think my phase of being a journalist in this country, it's pretty much over.
Has come to an end.
Yeah.
Has
Hmm.
come to an end. So,
Yes.
uh, it's an example of how a lot of chapters have been closed uh, to begin new ones.
Yes.
To begin new
Exactly. No,
ones.
it wasn't. It was a tremendous event, world event, and it
Yes.
wasn't just in one place. It was in the whole world,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it shook so many things,
Mm-hmm.
and so many people.
It sure did.
So
It
yeah.
sure did.
Hmm.
One of the things, to go back in time a little bit, that I am really curious to hear your thoughts on is the emotional experience of the journalist. I've had brief conversations with you about it before, and I've heard similar things from other friends who are also journalists. It is really interesting to notice parallels between the emotional experience of a journalist and that of helping professionals.
Hmm.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm I'm curious to hear more about it, and definitely how it unfolded during and since the pandemic.
Well, as a journalist, much like as a psychotherapist or as a doctor, or as I don't know, police officer, fire, I don't know, fireman, whatever you want to, these kinds of professions where you have to be in touch with the pain and the problems of the people
Constantly.
constantly. Everything's negative, everything's problems, everything's, all the analysis of the worst of the worst.
Yes.
um well, you have to develop some kind of mechanism to deal with that, and you do. That doesn't mean things don't affect you, but it means that you develop some protections,
Mm-hmm.
and you try to keep your distance. And that becomes harder and harder over the years, I think. At least it has for me.
Mm-hmm.
I was just telling you that I was just listening to the presidential debate, which is happening today as we record this. And at some point, I had to turn it off because, and I have covered all the presidential elections since 1992, covered all the debates. um, at some point, I don't have a stomach for this political discourse
Mm-hmm.
anymore. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, it has gotten worse, a lot worse
Mm-hmm.
over the years.
Yes.
So
Without a
that's why
doubt.
that's why I don't want to do that kind of journalism anymore. And I don't anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Right now I'm doing something
Mm-hmm.
tangential to that, but not really daily journalism or political journalism.
Would you liken that to burnout?
Say that again.
Would you liken that resistance to that kind of journalism to an experience of burnout?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a little bit of burnout
Mm-hmm.
for me. It happened with the immigration piece as well. I did cover immigration a lot, and I wrote a book about immigration, like
Mm-hmm.
as you just said.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, I became fed up with the whole thing. Like, okay, I don't want to cover this anymore.
It's a lot.
I do it occasionally in the job that I have now. I organize Zoom events for ethnic journalists,
Mm-hmm.
and we touch on different topics. And I occasionally, obviously, touch on this, but it's not something I want to cover day in and day out
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah.
And neither is politics. And those
Yeah.
two were the two things I most cover in 35 years as a
35
journalist.
years.
So yeah, I think I would call myself like a political junkie. I love to look at debates. I love to like go to conventions and all that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the taste of that anymore.
Yeah.
Like I'm at
Yeah.
some point in like, okay, I let others do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
you know.
It's been a long enough journey for you.
Yes. And life you get older
Mm-hmm.
and you think, oh, how much more do I have in life? How much time do I have in my life? I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. Nobody
Mm-hmm.
knows.
Right.
So
Another thing the pandemic made us really ponder.
yes. Yeah.
Uh, you know,
Mortality.
how
Yeah.
do I
Health.
use my time? Do I just use it? Do I invest my time?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm.
yeah, it's a little bit of burnout, and it's also time.
It just feels like it,
Yeah.
like it's time, like it's time. I'm curious, when you were in the role of training uh, future journalists, did you ever had conversations with them about how to navigate the emotional experience of being a journalist, uh, so that they were aware that it's a practice to be developed?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little. It's not something you go too much into when you're
Mm-hmm.
I was teaching kind of the basic courses in journalism.
I see.
So but I would talk about my experiences and they would ask me questions.
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with this? And
Yeah.
how do you interview people you don't agree with and things like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is a
I
challenge.
get those questions too.
Yeah.
Therapists get those questions all the time,
Mm-hmm.
and I was curious about how you involved that in the training of others, because that is part of our training, how to be in the presence of sharp contrast
Mm-hmm.
with your point of views,
Yeah.
and then the feelings that come up, and I'm hoping that this is something that is discussed more and more among, professionals in other fields where there's such an emotionally charged experience going on for you almost daily,
Yes.
because it's essential to give attention to that if you're going to be fully present.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's one of the things that the pandemic made visible
I think
too.
sadly I don't remember any course in my journalism. Like I went to school in Venezuela. I
Mm,
took 5 years of journalism. Like the whole major was 5 years.
mm-hmm.
I don't remember any course
Yeah, yeah,
relating to that, to
mm-hmm.
how to handle things like that. No,
Yeah,
we weren't like, we're not trained about so many things in our lives. We weren't trained for that. You had to
mm-hmm.
learn that on the job,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know.
yeah. Well, may it spread.
Yes,
May
hopefully.
may that mindfulness spread.
It does look like we are less and less able you know, to deal with our feelings, and with social media being so toxic. People using social media in such a toxic way sometimes to
Yeah,
interact with each other.
so true. And yet, it was one of the things that kept many people going at a time when they felt isolated.
Oh, absolutely.
It also is part of what invited some people into considering some forms of support, because that's where they saw it. So it really is such a great example of how technology um, may not be the issue. It's how you choose to use it.
Yes. Yes.
You know,
It's definitely a tool, and it depends on how you use it.
how
And
you
there's
use it.
really I love social media, but I
Mm-hmm.
recognize the toxicity of it.
Oh, there
Uh,
is a lot of it.
Yes.
A lot of it. And may we remember to rely on multiple sources of information rather than putting all eggs in one basket.
Yes.
Dangerous.
Yeah, and again, we talk about the discredit of professions like journalism. When people say, "Oh, I'll do my own research," well, you have to know how to do research.
That part. That part. That part. And to feel invited to research, because one issue that it's painful. I'm just going to say it's painful. The idea that books are banned to further the cause of the oppressing community. Well,
Hmm.
that's not the only source. It's a powerful source, and it's important to resist uh, banning,
Yes.
but it's not the only source. So let's be invited to learn how to do research, to do it well.
Hmm.
So I thank you for the work you've done for more than 35 years.
Mm.
I mean, 35 years is the official
Yes.
amount of
Let's keep
years.
it that way.
But there's more. There's so much more. And you've made a powerful mark in this, you know, in this field.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank all of you for joining us today. Hopefully, these reflections add well to yours. And if this was your first time, I invite you to subscribe. See you soon.